said that the concept of the modern world dates back to the Renaissance, when human culture was altered considerably in the Western world. The idea of the modern world, when situated at this time, is usually seen in terms of its modernity. Its modernity. Signified by marked changes in human culture or marked changes in human cultural awareness. So at this time in human history, there was a marked alteration in the understanding of human culture, especially the secularization of society. Especially the secularization of society. Society is said to be secularized when it is driven mostly by civil laws rather than religious rules and regulations. When society is human-centered, driven by chiefly human concerns, such a society is said to be secular, and it is in stark contrast to a society that is run by religious laws. So such was the idea of modernity in the Renaissance because of the revival in Greek classical learning and literature. Another aspect of modernity attributed to this time in human history, by this I mean the 16th century. By this time I mean the 16th century. Is the European persons love for voyage and adventure. The European person's love for voyage and adventure. Which led to the discovery of many lands far away from Europe. Far away from Europe. Like the New World, which is today's America and the Caribbean, Africa and India. were discovered at this time. Because the adventurous spirit of the European person, reinforced with inventions and discoveries in science, like physics and astronomy, led to the Europeans venturing far away from home so that they were able to discover new lands like the New World, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. So the paying of less emphasis on religion and focusing on the secular, the material world led to scientific achievements that made these discoveries of distant lands possible. This is another aspect of modernity that you have to account for. So you need to note that the discovery of these lands contributed to the incidents of colonization that we want to study as an aspect of the course. So another aspect of modernity that we need to consider is the idea of enlightenment. The idea of enlightenment. The Enlightenment project. The Europeans who went to America in the late 15th century, like Christopher Columbus, thought of themselves as torchbearers, as people who were carrying European civilization to these different places. They thought themselves to be superior creatures compared to these people. Or at least they made the world to believe that they were the superior creatures, even when it might not have been so. So they needed to propagate an ideology of superiority so as to be able to execute the Enlightenment agenda on these unfortunate peoples of the earth. And what was the Enlightenment all about? Enlightenment was the idea that science and its knowledge could transform human world, science and its knowledge could transform the human world, not only when applied to Europe, but also when taken to other parts of the world. By this time, we're already talking about the 18th century. And the Europeans felt that they knew enough, they were educated enough, they were advanced enough to carry the torch of enlightenment around the world. So the modern world is seen in terms of the rich. Or the extent of the rich. The rich, I mean R-E-S-C-H, or the extent of the rich of the European Enlightenment all around the globe, given scientific inventions and knowledge, given the presence of scientific inventions and knowledge. Because you see, the modern world is a small world. In the modern world, we're no longer living far apart. In the modern world, we are connected. The modern world is a small world. In the modern world, we are no longer far apart. We are no longer partitioned. We no longer stay at home. We no longer lack knowledge of other people's cultures in different places. In the modern world, we are talking about community, togetherness, oneness, one humanity. In the modern world, we are talking about the global village. In the modern world, we are talking about different cultural orientations competing in a single space. In the modern world, we are talking about clash of cultures. However, as it is with all human achievements, they are all full of paradoxes. The modern world ideology is full of paradoxes, which are all interrogated in the literature of the modern world. They are all full of paradoxes. They are all interrogated in the literature of the modern world. And what are these paradoxes? Paradoxes are seen in the idea that what was proposed, right? What was proposed as the official policy and statements of the Enlightenment project was all wrapped up in ironies. So what was proposed as the official statement or policy of the Enlightenment project was all wrapped up in what? Ironies. Ironies like slavery. Ironies like slavery. Ironies like economic exploitation. Of indigenous people in the name of colonialism. And of course, you know that literature loves ironies. And so, to read the literature of the modern world is to read the different stories that depict the ironic nature, or perhaps the paradoxical nature of the Enlightenment project. So it would appear that the Enlightenment project was overtaken by the perennial human greed, the greed in the human soul. Perennial human greed. The greed that is always found in the human soul. Take slavery, for instance. Because slavery is one of the fallouts of modernity. Okay? Take slavery, for instance. When the Europeans got to America, they came in contact with vast arable lands that was good for agriculture. The Europeans got to America. They came in contact with vast arable lands, very good for agriculture. Vast arable lands, good for agriculture. But the native Indians, the original owners of America, the people they went there to meet. Native Indians, the original owners of America, would not be enslaved, would not be forced to work in the plantations that these Europeans created. Already, the diseases that the Europeans took to America killed off many of these native Indians who were living in innocence and purity in their lands. The diseases that the Europeans took to America had killed off most of these native Indians who were living innocently and in purity in their land that did not know disease ever. Of course, part of the irony of the modern world is that Christopher Columbus and his agents are celebrated as the discoverers of America. They even have a day devoted to that celebration in American history. But we have played down on the dark history of Christopher Columbus, especially the fact that he also massacred many of these native Indians because they resisted, because of their resistance to the invasion of their lands by these European strangers. So Christopher Columbus had massacred and also killed so many of the native Indians, whether in the Americas or those in the Caribbean, the Caribs and the Arawaks. So those are the parts of the history of the modern world that they will not want the world to know, but which have to be told to constitute some of the paradoxes and the irony of modernity. So because of the shortage of laborers, the willingness of the native Indians to be enslaved in their own land, their resistance, and all that, they had to look to Africa. In fact, it was a reverend father who suggested that they should look to Africa for slaves. People who come and work in vast plantation. When we say vast, it means that it is big. Right? Vast plantation. And that was how slavery started. And slavery is part of the paradoxes of the modern world. That a supposedly civilized human race who wanted to carry the torch of civilization to different parts of the world had to stoop so low as to enslave other human beings and use them as just commodities, like any goods. Because the human slave was worse than was than animal that was roaming freely in the bush. Right? Yes. The human slave was worse than any animal that was roaming freely in the bush. The human slave was in charge of someone's property. So this is still part of the history of the modern world. So the Europeans came to Africa first to look for slaves. Okay? In the 17th century. The trade in human goods succeeded in Africa largely because there were traditional structures in place that allowed for such a trade to succeed. By that I mean that there was some form of slave system in place in some parts of Africa. Okay? For instance, if you were conquered in a war, you were likely to be a slave. But it was benign compared to what the Europeans brought. Benign. Okay? One could be enslaved either through being conquered in warfare or through indebtedness. One could be enslaved either through conquest. in traditional African societies, one could be enslaved either through conquest or indebtedness or laws of morality. Laws of morality. Laws of morality. By that I mean you could do something that is so bad that you are turned into slave as a punishment. Laws of status. You do something and then you lose your citizenship status. You could be a slave in another man's land. But what the Europeans brought was a completely different system where large amounts of money was paid to buy people. The trade was so profitable that hardly was there any king who could ignore it for humanistic reason, for any humanistic reason. Because you just stayed and watched the surrounding kingdoms getting richer and more powerful by selling human beings as slaves. And you want to be good, and you're losing revenue, and you're getting weaker and weaker, and you might be overrun. So it was so powerful, the trade was so profitable, that hardly was there anyone who, for altruistic or humanistic reasons, to refuse to participate. So the reward, the monetary reward, the economic reward for slavery was what drove the trade in Africa. Economic reward, the monetary reward is what drove. So we are talking about the modern world, where what happens in one place affects everywhere. Because the world is now a community. We are not being partitioned anymore into different places. It's now one village, one global village. And so what happens in Europe will reverberate in Africa and all around the world. Okay? So slavery was an indicator of the extent to which human morality could err. The extent to which human morality could err. Right? Until today, it is a metaphor, it remains a metaphor for all economic predatory tendencies. So today, slavery remains a metaphor for all economic predatory tendencies that rob other human beings of their dignity and pride of place in the world. Okay? Because whether you like it or not, you must grapple with the fact that slavery still exists in different metaphoric forms in the world today. Some of the economic models, some of the economic practices that we grapple with in the world today are still drawn from the slave model, slavery model. Okay? will take only a discerning scholar to see the traces of slavery in contemporary economic practices. It will take only the most discerning scholars to still notice the traces of slavery in contemporary economic practices. Okay, at the initial point of it, a human being could be exchanged for a mirror. A human being could be exchanged for a mirror. In fact, from history, mirror was a highly prized commodity, so that at a point there was no limit to the number of slaves that could be given away just for one mirror. Just for one mirror. The king only wanted to have the mirror to look at himself in his palace, and he would not hesitate to give away as many of his slaves, subjects as possible to have the mirror. These slaves were taken to the New World to work in the plantations because remember that stereotypical idea that the Africans are very strong and could endure many hours of work with little food and water. So it was economically profitable to have Africans work for Europeans in these plantations. Okay? And of course, given the inhuman nature of the journey, it would only be the strongest of the strongest that will survive when the ship finally reached America. Given the inhuman nature of the journey, it will only be the strongest of the strongest that will survive when the ship finally got to America. The rest would have died through diseases, through hunger. During the months of the journey at sea, some would have died, some could not trek from the hinterland to the port. Some could not trek, some could not endure the long trek from the hinterland to the port, where they will be loaded into the ship. So they will die on the road, and they'll be left there to rot, cut off from the others and left there to rot. Others will make it to the port, then loaded into the ship, but they will not survive the months of the journey to America, and so they'll have to be thrown overboard when they die. So it was only the strongest of the strongest that got to survive the journey. And so once they got to America, they will be so prized. I think slavery was like the crude oil today's economy. So they'll be so prized that the ownership of one or two slaves could make you rich forever. Your slaves survive to the New World, and you're able to sell one or two, you're made. So they were the richest of the richest who engaged in the trade. And of course, it was a status to have a slave. It was a status to have a slave. So just like any despicable act that touches on humanity, slavery had to come to an end. After all the campaigns against it, by activists, as well as the invention of machines to take care of human labor, which meant that slaves were no longer really needed. And so, of course, I think the slaves themselves were the ones who saved their future generation from being enslaved, because when they were assigned to do a particular job, they would find the easiest way to do that. And to find the easiest way to do the job, they had to do what? They had to invent machines that will help them do the work faster. So it was the slaves themselves who saved that future generation from hard work. Okay? So you need to understand that necessity is the mother of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. Most of the machines that you have, simple machines that you have to make work easier, were invented by slaves, because it was to make work easier for them. They were assigned the work, and since they didn't want to die doing the work, they had to devise simpler means of doing the work, and so they invented the machines. So most of the machines were invented by slaves themselves, which with time made it necessary for slavery to be abolished, because there were machines to do the work. Okay? That's the idea. So with the abolition of slavery, the Europeans needed to have newer partnership with the colonies. The Europeans needed to have newer partnership with the colonies, and this time in the form of the legitimate trade. The legitimate trade should be written in quotation marks, because it was not legitimate at all. It was still an unbalanced trade relations between Africa and the rest of the world, or between Europeans and the colonies. And this happened mostly in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, after slavery was abolished. After slavery was abolished. The legitimate trade was signaled by the Berlin Conference. Held in 1884 and 1885. Held between 1884 and 1885 in Germany. During the conference, the Europeans competed to own different parts of Africa. The Europeans competed to own different parts of Africa. competed to be assigned different parts of Africa for purposes of the colonial project, economic exploitation and civilization. So the African map was kept on the table, and different parts of Africa divided among powerful European nations. Well, among powerful European nations like Belgium, like France, like Britain, like Portugal, like Germany, and so after this conference, there was more or less stability and orderliness in the exploitation of Africa, but because before now, the Europeans were fighting themselves in Africa. The Europeans were fighting themselves in Africa. They want to say, I'm supposed to be here, you're not supposed to be here. But after the conference, it was more orderly. The exploitation of Africa was more orderly because everyone now had that territory to exploit. All right? But the official policy was that they were coming to Africa to bring what? Civilization. The official policy was that they were coming to Africa to bring enlightenment, civilization, to the natives, to the brutes. The natives, whom they call brutes, savages, right? To the primitive people of Africa. But the real intention was what? Economic. In return for bringing what they call civilization, they will exploit the land and took the resources from the land. Okay? And the resources that were looted from Africa, whether it was rubber, whether it was ivory, whether it was oil, these are the resources that made Europe what it is today. And Europe will never be poor, England will never be poor because of Africa. The resources that they took from Africa that has made Europe the powerful continent that it is today that will never be poor. They didn't have nothing. So in exchange for looting these resources, they brought us religion, the Bible, and those empty missionary schools. Brought us religion, the Bible, and those empty missionary schools that did not teach science and technology, but only taught the Bible and morality. Just be a good boy while we take all your resources. Be a good boy. While we take your resources from you, be a good boy. Hold on to the Bible. Hold on to the Bible while we hold on to your land. Right? At this time in Europe, they had science, they had technology, but they did not bring that science and technology to teach young Africans. What they brought was the Bible, to teach morality, to make the Africans become psychologically keen, while they used guns to loot all the resources. The guns were necessary where there were resistance, because some people were still not fooled. Some people were still wise and resisted them. So where there was resistance, they will use the gun. Where the Bible did not work, they will use the gun. So at the end of the day, it is discovered that the legitimate trade that succeeded slavery, because of course slavery was seen as the illegitimate trade. So the legitimate trade that succeeded slavery was an unbalanced trade relations between Africa and Europe, and of course Europe and the rest of the colonies. Was an unbalanced trade relations. And somehow, even when we are talking about, even when we are discussing the neo-colonial era that we find ourselves today, the trade relations between Europe and Africa is still unbalanced, right? The trade relations between Europe and Africa is still unbalanced. Okay. So if you, for instance, read Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, you will see these unbalanced trade relations being depicted. Okay? All that the European has to do is to bring simple toys and trinkets from Europe, and then will exchange it for many valuable goods, so that when he gets back to Europe, he will make 1,000 times profit of the toys that he brought to Africa. And somehow these things still continue to happen. Crusoe himself was surprised that he just brought some little toys, to Africa, and then when the things he took from Africa in exchange for those toys fetched him well when he got back to Europe. Okay? Because somehow these toys fascinated our leaders and our traders. Okay? After all, didn't they give away many slaves for one mirror? They gave away many slaves for just one mirror. So colonialism then is one of the most engaging topics in modern world literature. Whether it is in India, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in America, colonialism is one of the engaging topics in the modern world literature. So the Europeans came to Africa, took our resources in very cheap rates, or none at all. Some they took for free, some they stole, right? Some they took almost for free, some they stole. And then took them to Europe refined them and brought them back and sold at higher rates to Africans. That was the legitimate trade. Again, like all despicable acts against humanity, colonialism had to come to an end. Colonialism had to come to an end. Because more and more people saw through the white people and their tricks and fought against it. Some of these people were labeled rebels, and I can assure you it's not easy to be labeled a rebel, right? Because it always makes you look like Satan. Just like Satan was labeled a rebel by God in heaven. Okay? And of course, you know they have the Bible, so whenever they want to paint somebody black, they call the person Satan. But those people knew that they had a righteous cause, so they didn't mind being labeled satanic, and so they fought. They were able to stay in the bush for months, deny themselves food, sleep, or comfort, any kind of comfort, to cause discomfort to the white man to the point that he willingly decides, it's like, this game is up, we cannot play this game anymore. Let's go back, retreat, right? We have to go back. Because when the game is up, it is up. They couldn't stand the resistance all over the place, whether it was in South Africa, whether it was in East Africa, whether it was in the North. It was time to leave, you had to leave. But of course, before they left, they had to leave structures behind. Okay, so now we are talking about structural colonialism. Structural colonialism. Colonialism that is sustained by the structures that the colonial masters left behind in the erstwhile colony. Structural colonialism. Once you leave a structure in place, you don't need to be physically present anymore. Alright, this one is more effective. You don't have to be there anymore, but just leave the structure in place. The structure will continue to work for you while you're not there. We're talking about structural colonialism. Now, let's pause there for now. I want to talk about another aspect of the modern world. I want to talk about another aspect of the modern world. And this is the modern world around 1910. Modern world around 1910. So then we can say that specifically that the modern world is the 20th century. Excuse me. And its literature is the literature of the 20th century. modern world is the 20th century. And of course, 1910 is 20th century. As from 1900, it's 20th century. This is the word that is normally studied under modernism. So I want you to have an idea of the different ramifications of modernity. Okay. There is a space that normally interrogated as modernity or modernism between 1910 to 1930. Okay, this is another aspect of the modern world that we have to discuss. Okay, 1910 to 1920. It is thought that the Great Depression brought an end to that modern world. The Great Depression in 1930 signaled the end of the modern world, of modernism. So, it is modernism at this time that we normally use to talk about ruptures and breaks, radical ruptures and breaks. Radical ruptures and breaks. In human cultural awareness, in human relations. It's the 1910 to 1930 modernism. It is in the 1910 to 1930 modernism that we normally talk about the ruptures, the radical ruptures and breaks in human relations, human relationship, human cultural awareness. All right? There was a radical paradigm shift. There's a radical paradigm shift in human relations at this time. There's a radical paradigm shift in human relations at this time. There's a radical paradigm shift in human relations at this time. Especially the relationship between workers and their employers. Especially the relationship between workers and their employers. Especially the relationship between workers and their employers. Children and their parents. Children and their parents. Husbands and wives. Husbands and wives. Leaders and the subjects. Leaders and the subjects. Okay. Until this time, the relationship between these groups was fixed and unchanging. The relation between these two groups was fixed and unchanging. For instance, the citizens were subject to their leaders. Wives must be subject to the husband. Servants must be subject to the masters. So Christian. Question. And there was no question as to who was higher than the other. But in the modern world, things changed dramatically and drastically. In the modern world, things changed dramatically and drastically. Because the underdog in each category of the relationship, the underdog in each category of the relationship decided that they wanted more. Alright? The underdog in each category of the relationship. Could you identify the underdog in each category of the relationship? Yes. Good. So they decided that they wanted more. They wanted better conditions. They wanted more freedom. Alright? They decided that they wanted more spaces to explore. They decided that they cannot endure oppression anymore. That they needed more freedom. Right? And so they started agitation. They started protesting. They started making demands. They started asking questions why things were the way they were. For instance, the women asked why they could not vote. Why they could not go to school. Why they could not join certain professions. Why they could not own properties. Why was it that the world was all about men and no women was to be found in the world? Women asked. The workers wanted more wages, better condition, better working condition. The workers wanted more wages, better working condition. So these agitations have come to define our understanding of what the modern world is, what the modern world is all about. It was an era whereby through increased knowledge, established human relations were shaken to their foundation. Established human relations were shaken to their foundation. Even the relationship between man and God was shaken, was re-examined and shaken. Even the relationship between man and God was re-examined and shaken. Because people increasingly became irreligious. People increasingly became irreligious. Owing to scientific inventions. People increasingly became religious owing to scientific discoveries and inventions. People hardly believed in God anymore. And of course, the events of the First World War, also contributed to religious irreverence of many in the modern world by this period of time. The events of the First World War also contributed to the religious irreverence of many who lived at this time. The First World War lasted between 1914 and 1918. And saw the destruction of millions of lives through the use of sophisticated but dangerous weapons. Through the use of sophisticated but dangerous weapons. The use of sophisticated but dangerous weapons. Which was made possible by science and scientific invention. The carnage of the war made people to think that there was no good and loving God anywhere in the universe, watching over the affairs of man. There was no good and loving God anywhere in the universe, watching over the affairs of man. The carnage of the war made people to think that there was no good and loving God anywhere in the universe, watching over man's affairs. Otherwise, he would have intervened to stop the human suffering and misery at the time. Otherwise, he would have intervened to stop the untold human suffering and misery at the time. Okay? In ideologically, the modern world saw the propagation of radical ideologies. Philosophically, the modern world saw the propagation of radical ideologies that signaled a break with previous tradition. Philosophically, the modern world saw the propagation of radical ideologies that signaled a break with previous traditions. There were new philosophies that attempted to reinterpret reality within the context of what was going on at the time. And these philosophies signaled the break with previous generations of philosophies, or understanding of life and realities. These ideas and philosophy will also affect how literature is viewed in the modern world. This philosophy will also, this ideology will also radically revise how we should view literature in the modern world. So the modern world that we discussed from 1910 to 1930 is one that signaled a break with tradition. Now, with what? Tradition. Break with tradition. And all previously held notions about art, literature, and reality. So when you talk about modern world novelists in the 20th century, we're talking about Virginia Woolf. Talk about Virginia Woolf. We're talking about Joseph Conrad. Talk about James Joyce. Talk about D.H. Lawrence. Talk about D.H. Lawrence. Talk about Catherine Mansfield. Talk about Aldous Huxley. We're going to talk about Joyce Carey. Among other novelists. So the major writers of the modern world are Virginia Woolf, Joseph Conrad, James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Catherine Mansfield, Aldous Huxley, and Joyce Carey, among others. So if you see any of their works anywhere, you should read them as modern world writers, novelists. They of course had their precursors, but these are the core modern world writers whose work could be interrogated under modernism. Okay, that we are talking about. So we are going to pause here for today. When we come back, we'll continue with some of the techniques that mark the modern world literature from literatures of other era before it. Morning.